1. The abandoned school bus. Marcus Chen had been driving the I-80 corridor between Sacramento and Reno for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to perishable goods across the Sierra Nevada mountains. He'd seen his share of oddities on the highway, abandoned vehicles, wildlife crossings, even the occasional confused hiker, but nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered on a frigid February night in 2019. It was approaching midnight when Marcus began his descent from Donner Pass, his 18-wheeler loaded with commercial refrigeration units destined for a casino in Reno. The weather had turned nasty an hour earlier, with wet snow beginning to accumulate on the roadway. His CB radio crackled with chatter from other drivers discussing road conditions and chain requirements. Marcus had driven worse weather, so he maintained his pace, his headlights cutting through the swirling snow. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape on the shoulder, barely visible through the curtain of snowfall. As his truck drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his foot instinctively toward the brake pedal. It was a school bus, the full-sized kind that carried 30 or 40 children, sitting at an odd angle on the gravel shoulder. But this wasn't just any breakdown. The bus was ancient, its yellow paint faded to a sickly ochre color, with rust eating through the panels in irregular patches. Marcus's training kicked in. A stranded vehicle in these conditions could mean people in danger. He activated his hazard lights and brought his rig to a stop about 50 yards ahead of the bus, positioning his truck to provide some protection from traffic. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and his CB handset, radioing his position to other drivers and reporting the abandoned vehicle. The cold hit him like a physical force when he stepped out of his cab. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and the wind whipped snow into his face. Marcus pulled his hood tight and trudged back toward the bus, his flashlight beam dancing across its weathered exterior. As he got closer, details emerged that deepened his unease. The bus had no license plate. The emergency exit door at the rear hung partially open, swinging gently in the wind with a rhythmic creaking sound. The windows were covered with grime so thick he couldn't see inside. "Highway Patrol, this is anyone near mile marker 168 on westbound I-80, Marcus called into CB. "I've got what looks like an abandoned school bus on the shoulder, checking for occupants now." Static was his only reply. He tried again, but the radio seemed dead, which was strange considering it had worked perfectly just minutes ago. Marcus approached the folding door at the front of the bus. It stood open, revealing a set of steps ascending into darkness. He aimed his flashlight inside and his breath caught in his throat. The interior of the bus looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. The seats were shredded, with stuffing spilling out onto the floor. Graffiti covered the walls, but not the typical tags or crude drawings. Instead, there were desperate messages scratched into the metal. "Help US. Don't stop. Turn back," and most disturbingly, "ITS still here." Against every instinct screaming at him to return to his truck, Marcus climbed aboard. His boots crunched on broken glass and debris. The beam of his flashlight swept across the interior, revealing more details that shouldn't exist. Children's backpacks lay scattered in the aisle, their contents spilled across the floor, notebooks with homework from the 1970s based on the dates he could see, lunch boxes featuring cartoon characters he vaguely remembered from his childhood. But everything was wrong. The decay was too advanced, too thorough, as if the bus had been sitting here for 50 years instead of the few hours it would take for snow to accumulate on its roof. Then he noticed the smell. Beneath the expected odors of mildew and rust was something else, something sweet and rotten that made his stomach turn. It reminded him of the time he'd hauled a refrigerated trailer that had lost power, spoiling an entire load of meat. But this was worse, more organic, more wrong. Marcus moved deeper into the bus, compelled by a need to understand what had happened here. The emergency exit at the rear still hung open, and through it, he could see his truck's hazard lights blinking in the distance. The normalcy of that sight provided an anchor to reality that he desperately needed. He was about halfway down the aisle when his flashlight beam caught something that made him stop cold. There were dolls arranged on one of the seats. Not children's dolls, but lifelike figures dressed in old-fashioned school clothes, positioned as if they were having a conversation. Their painted eyes seemed to follow his light, and their mouths were open in expressions that looked more like screams than smiles. Marcus had never been superstitious, but something about those dolls triggered a primal fear response. He needed to leave. Now, that's when he heard it. A sound from the very back of the bus, beyond the emergency exit. Footsteps crunching in the snow, small and light, like a child's footfalls. Then another sound joined it, and another, until it seemed like dozens of small feet were moving around the exterior of the bus. Marcus spun around, his flashlight cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Through the grimy windows, he could make out small shapes moving in the snow, child-sized silhouettes that seemed to flicker and jump like images from an old film reel. His CB radio suddenly burst to life with a sound that wasn't quite static and wasn't quite voices. It was like hearing someone speak underwater or from a great distance, words just beyond comprehension. The dolls on the seat, he could swear they had moved, their heads now turned in his direction. Marcus backed toward the exit, his heart hammering against his ribs. The footsteps outside grew louder, more insistent. Through the emergency exit, he could see small handprints appearing in the snow on the outside of the bus, dozens of them, pressing against the metal as if trying to get in, or trying to keep him inside. The temperature inside the bus seemed to be dropping rapidly, his breath now creating clouds so thick they obscured his vision. Marcus made his decision. He ran. His boots slipped on the debris-covered floor, nearly sending him sprawling, but he caught himself and lunged toward the front exit. As he passed the driver's seat, his flashlight briefly illuminated the rearview mirror, and what he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Reflected in that mirror was not the empty bus behind him, but rows of children, their faces pale and distorted, mouths open in silent screams, all staring directly at him. He burst out of the bus and into the snow, not caring about the cold, focused only on reaching his truck. The small footprints in the snow now surrounded the bus completely, and as he ran, he could hear that underwater CB voice growing louder, almost forming words. He didn't look back. He reached his truck, yanked open the door, and threw himself inside, slamming it behind him and hitting the door lock. His hands shook as he started the engine, the familiar diesel rumble, the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Marcus put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, his eyes locked on the road ahead. But in his side mirror, he watched the bus. For just a moment before the snow obscured it completely, every window of that bus was filled with small, pale faces, all watching him leave. Then his CB radio crackled to life with crystal clarity. "You shouldn't have stopped." The voice was young, childlike, with something that might have been sadness or might have been warning. He drove straight through to Reno without stopping, arriving 3 hours later. When the highway patrol later asked about his report of an abandoned vehicle, they found nothing at mile marker 168. No bus, no tire tracks, no evidence anything had been there at all. The snow had covered everything, they said. But Marcus knew better. He submitted his resignation 2 weeks later, taking a job at a local warehouse. He never drove I-80 through Donner Pass again, and he never spoke about what he saw in that bus to anyone except his wife, who noticed he'd started having nightmares about children calling out to him from the darkness. Sometimes late at night, his old CB radio, which he'd kept in his garage, would crackle to life on its own, and he'd hear what sounded like children singing, their voices echoing from somewhere far away, or perhaps from somewhere that existed outside of normal space and time altogether. Story 2. The midnight hitchhiker. Daniel Kowalski had a simple rule after 23 years of long-haul trucking: never pick up hitchhikers. It wasn't personal, just a sensible policy that had kept him out of trouble since he started driving commercially in 1996. But on a desolate stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada, the so-called loneliest road in America, Daniel broke his rule, and that decision changed everything. It was mid-July 2018, and the heat radiating off the asphalt created shimmering mirages even at 2 in the morning. Daniel was hauling a load of construction equipment from Salt Lake City to Carson City, running behind schedule due to a delayed loading dock. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of darkness cutting through the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert. His headlights were the only illumination for miles in any direction, and the radio had lost its signal an hour ago, leaving him alone with the rumble of his engine and his own thoughts. That's when his headlights caught the figure standing beside the road. At first, Daniel thought it might be a roadside marker or a piece of debris, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into a person, a woman in a white dress, her arm extended with her thumb out in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. She stood perfectly still, not moving despite the wind from passing vehicles, which struck Daniel as odd because he realized he hadn't seen another car for at least 40 minutes. His foot moved to the brake pedal almost against his will. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to keep driving, but something about the woman's posture, the way she stood there in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night, triggered a response he couldn't ignore. What if she was in real trouble? What if her car had broken down and she'd been walking for hours? In this heat, even at night, dehydration could kill someone quickly. Daniel brought his rig to a stop about 20 yards past the woman, his air brakes hissing in the silence. He grabbed his CB microphone out of habit, intending to report the pickup to other drivers on the channel. But when he keyed the mic, he got only static, not unusual in this remote area, but unsettling nonetheless. Through his passenger mirror, he watched the woman approach his truck. She moved with an odd, gliding gait, as if her feet weren't quite touching the ground. The white dress she wore looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s, with a full skirt and fitted bodice. When she reached his passenger door, Daniel leaned over and opened it, the interior light flooding the cab. "You all right, ma'am? Need a ride to the next town?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too loud in the vast silence of the desert night. The woman looked up at him, and Daniel felt his mouth go dry. She was beautiful in an unsettling way, with pale skin that seemed almost luminous in the dim light, dark hair pulled back in an elaborate style, and eyes that reflected the dashboard lights with an odd greenish sheen. When she smiled, her teeth seemed too white, too perfect. "Thank you," she said, her voice oddly flat without inflection. "I've been waiting such a long time." She climbed into the cab with surprising grace, settling into the passenger seat and pulling the door closed behind her. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud. Daniel put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, acutely aware of the woman's presence beside him. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. The temperature in the cab seemed to have dropped despite the warm night, and Daniel found himself suppressing a shiver. "Where you headed?" he asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "West," she replied, still not looking at him. "I'm going west. I've been going west for a very long time." "Well, I'm heading to Carson City. Can drop you in Fallon if that works. Got a gas station there, phones, you can call someone." Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel her watching him now, her gaze heavy and invasive. "Time is different now," she said, and Daniel had no idea how to respond to that. "Do you know what year it is?" The question sent a chill down his spine. 18, ma'am. July 14th, 2018. She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. "So long, it's been so very long." She finally turned to look at him directly, and Daniel made the mistake of meeting her gaze. Her eyes were wrong. They reflected the dashboard lights, but the reflection moved independently of the light source, swirling and shifting like oil on water. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I don't remember," she said. "I remember the car, though. A blue Chevrolet Bel Air 1957. My father had just bought it. We were so proud, the first new car our family had ever owned. We were driving to California, going to start a new life. My mother, my father, my little brother, and me. It was night just like this. We'd been driving for hours." Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. There was something deeply wrong about the way she spoke, the odd cadence of her words, the way she described everything in present tense as if it were happening now. "The other car came out of nowhere," she continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "No headlights, just darkness moving fast. We swerved and my father overcorrected. The car rolled 3 times. I remember flying, the world spinning, glass everywhere. I remember my mother screaming. And then nothing. Just darkness and the sound of wind and the feeling of waiting. "Ma'am, I think maybe we should get you to a hospital," Daniel said, his mouth dry. "You might have been in an accident, might be confused." "Look at the odometer," she interrupted him. Daniel glanced down at his dashboard. The digital odometer was going haywire, the numbers spinning backward rapidly, the miles decreasing instead of increasing. 245789245612245,438. The numbers blurred as they raced backward. His GPS screen flickered and died, then came back on showing a map that was subtly wrong, the roads in different places, towns that didn't exist appearing on the display. "What the hell?" Daniel started, but the woman cut him off. "We never made it to California," she said. "We're still here on this road in that moment between living and dying, spinning through the air, waiting for the impact that will never come. And sometimes when someone stops, we can step outside that moment for just a little while. We can pretend we're still alive, still going west, still full of hope and dreams." Daniel's blood ran cold. He looked at the road ahead and realized with mounting horror that they were passing the same mile marker they 5 minutes ago. Mile marker 78. Then again and again, the road was looping, bringing them past the same point over and over, though they were driving in a straight line. "This isn't real," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "You need to get out. You need to get out of my truck right now." "I can't," she said, and for the first time, real emotion entered her voice, a deep, aching sadness. "None of us can. We're bound here to this road, to that moment. My mother is still screaming. My brother is still crying. My father is still trying to turn the wheel, still trying to save us. We're frozen in that instant, and we've been frozen there since 1958. The temperature in the cab had dropped to freezing. Daniel could see his breath now, great clouds of vapor that shouldn't exist in a Nevada summer. The woman's form was beginning to flicker, becoming translucent. Through her body, he could see the passenger seat, the door panel beyond. "But you stopped," she continued, her voice fading. "You stopped, and that means you're part of our moment now. Time is different here. You'll understand soon." Daniel looked at his dashboard clock. It read 2:47 a.m. It had read 2:47 a.m. when he picked up the hitchhiker. It had read 2:47 a.m. for what felt like an hour of driving. Time had stopped, or he'd stepped outside of it, or something far worse. In a panic, he slammed on the brakes, the truck's air brakes screaming in protest. The woman in white vanished like smoke, leaving only a faint scent of jasmine and motor oil. The truck skidded to a stop in the middle of the empty highway, and suddenly everything was normal again. The temperature returned to its usual warmth. His GPS flickered back to life, showing the correct map, and his odometer was counting forward normally. But when Daniel looked in his passenger mirror, his heart nearly stopped. Standing on the shoulder behind him was the woman in white, exactly where he'd first seen her, her arm extended, thumb out. And behind her, barely visible in the darkness, were other figures. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothing from different eras, all standing motionless beside the road, all with their thumbs out, all waiting. Daniel didn't wait to see more. He floored the accelerator, his truck roaring back to life, racing down Highway 50 at speeds he'd never normally risk. He drove straight through to Carson City without stopping, even for fuel, running his tanks down to empty. When he finally pulled into a truck stop 3 hours later, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. He quit long-haul trucking the next week, taking a regional that kept him close to home and far from Highway 50. But sometimes, when he's driving at night and his dashboard clock seems to stick on a particular time, he feels a chill run down his spine and remembers the woman in white and her story of being forever trapped in a moment between life and death. And he wonders if somewhere on that lonely Nevada highway, his own reflection might be standing beside the road with the others, thumb extended, waiting for someone to stop, waiting to pull another soul into that endless moment where time stands still and the dead walk among the living, forever going west but never arriving. Story 3. The Following Truck. Rebecca Martinez prided herself on being unshakable. After 8 years driving solo across the American interstate system, she'd encountered every type of weather, every variety of mechanical failure, and every breed of highway hazard. She'd navigated ice storms in Wyoming, sandstorms in Arizona, and fog so thick in Oregon that she couldn't see her own hood. But nothing in her experience prepared her for the night she was followed by a truck that shouldn't exist. It started on I-40 in the Texas Panhandle, a stretch of highway Rebecca knew well from dozens of previous runs. She was hauling electronics from Dallas to Albuquerque, running a few hours behind schedule due to traffic delays in Fort Worth. The sun had set an hour ago, and the landscape had transformed into an endless expanse of darkness, punctuated only by the occasional ranch light miles from the highway. Her cab was comfortable, the climate control set to 72 degrees, satellite radio playing classic rock at low volume, cruise control locked at 67 miles per hour. At 9:43 p.m., according to her dashboard clock, Rebecca noticed headlights in her driver's side mirror. This wasn't unusual. Trucks passed and were passed constantly on the interstate. But something about these lights caught her attention. They maintained an exact distance behind her, neither gaining nor falling back, staying 3 truck lengths back with mathematical precision. Rebecca adjusted her speed slightly, dropping to 65. The lights maintained their distance. She accelerated to 70. The lights stayed exactly 3 truck lengths back. Rebecca picked up her CB radio, keying the mic. "This is Blue Angel westbound on I-40 near mile marker 89. Anyone running behind me want to pass?" "You've been on my tail for about 10 minutes, Static answered her. And on different channels, but got nothing except the occasional crackle of interference. Her satellite radio continued to work fine, which was odd. Usually, if weather interfered with signals, it affected everything. She tried to get a better look at the following truck in her mirrors. The headlights were old-style sealed beams, not the modern projector-style lights most contemporary trucks used. The spacing and height suggested a classic long-nose conventional truck, something from the 70s or 80s. She could make out a vague shape behind the lights, but details were impossible to discern in the darkness. Miles passed. The truck maintained its position with unnerving consistency. Rebecca began marking her position obsessively, calling out mile markers to herself. Mile 94, mile 97, mile 103. The truck never varied its distance, never wavered even slightly. This shouldn't be possible. Even with modern cruise control and lane keeping assistance, vehicles naturally drift slightly, varying their positions relative to other traffic. But this truck moved as if it were locked onto her position by some invisible tether. At mile marker 112, Rebecca made a decision. She flipped on her turn signal and began moving toward the exit ramp, a small rest area she'd stopped at before. If the truck was just a coincidence, it would continue on the highway. But the lights followed her, matching her deceleration perfectly, maintaining that same exact distance as she took the exit and pulled into the nearly empty rest area parking lot. Rebecca's heart was pounding now. She pulled into a parking space under one of the sodium vapor lights that bathed the rest area in harsh orange illumination, and immediately looked in her mirrors to see the truck that had followed her. But the parking lot behind her was empty. The headlights had vanished. The truck was simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. She sat in her cab for 10 minutes, scanning the parking lot, the highway beyond, anywhere the mystery truck might have gone. Nothing. There were only two other vehicles in the lot, a minivan near the restrooms and a sedan at the far end. No truck, no headlights, no sign of anything that could have been following her. Rebecca checked her dash cam footage, rewinding to review the last 20 minutes. The footage showed her view of the highway ahead, her instrument panel reflected in the windshield. But when she tried to see the following truck in the mirror reflections captured on video, there was nothing. Just darkness where the headlights should have been. Telling herself she'd imagined it, that fatigue had played tricks on her mind, Rebecca used the facilities, coffee from the vending machine, and returned to the highway. She'd lost nearly half an hour, but she'd make it up. The night was clear, traffic was light, and she had a delivery deadline to meet. At mile marker 127, the headlights returned. They appeared in her mirror without warning, already in position 3 truck lengths back, as if they'd been there all along and she simply hadn't noticed. But Rebecca had been watching her mirrors obsessively since rejoining the highway. The truck hadn't approached from behind, hadn't passed and dropped back. It was just suddenly there, like a scene transition in a film. Rebecca's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "All right," she muttered to herself. "Let's see what you do with this." She began varying her speed more dramatically, accelerating to 75, then dropping to 60, then back up to 70. The headlights matched every change instantly, maintaining that precise distance. She changed lanes. The truck changed lanes. She changed back. So did the truck. She grabbed her phone, thinking she'd call the state police, report suspicious behavior, get a trooper to check this out. But her phone showed no signal, which was impossible. She'd driven this route dozens of times and always had at least 2 bars of LTE coverage through this area. She was passing cell towers every few miles, but her phone insisted there was no signal at all. The CB radio erupted with sound, not voices, but a deep, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat amplified through the speaker. Rebecca twisted the volume knob, trying to turn it down, but the sound continued at the same volume regardless of the knob's position. Under the heartbeat sound, she could hear something else. Whispers. Dozens of voices whispering in unison, too low and overlapping to make out individual words, but creating a sound that made her skin crawl. At mile marker 145, Rebecca saw an emergency crossover ahead, a gap in the median that allowed official vehicles to turn around. Making a split-second decision, she cranked the wheel hard, her truck bouncing over the rough surface of the crossover, crossing the median and merging into the eastbound lanes, now heading back the way she'd come. It was dangerous, probably illegal, but she needed to break whatever pattern had established itself. She needed to escape the truck that shouldn't exist. For exactly 3 seconds, she was alone on the eastbound highway, her headlights cutting through the darkness, no other vehicles in sight. Then the familiar headlights appeared in her passenger mirror, maintaining their position on that side now, still exactly 3 truck lengths back. The truck had somehow found or appeared on the other side of the highway, or simply existed wherever it needed to be to maintain its following position. Rebecca's breath came in short gasps. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the headlights in her mirror were undeniably there, and when she looked more carefully, she could now make out more details of the truck behind them. It was indeed an old conventional, possibly a Kenworth or Peterbilt from the late 70s, with a classic long hood and a tall exhaust stack. But something about its proportions seemed wrong, stretched and distorted, as if she were seeing it through a warped lens. The whispers on the CB grew louder, and suddenly she could understand a single phrase repeated over and over. "Join us, join us, join us." The voice was multiplied, dozens or hundreds of voices speaking in perfect unison, and Rebecca realized with horror that she recognized some of those voices from traffic reports she'd heard over the years, truckers who'd called in accidents or breakdowns and then gone silent. She heard Tommy Redding, who disappeared on I-40 in 2015. She heard Sarah Chen, who'd vanished from I-10 in 2012. She heard at least a dozen others all speaking together, all calling to her. Mile marker 138. She was retracing her route, heading back east, and the truck followed. Rebecca's mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. Exhaustion hallucination, carbon monoxide leak in her cab, some kind of neurological event. But her truck's sensors showed normal cabin air quality, and she felt alert, her thinking clear despite her terror. She passed the rest area where she'd stopped before, the same minivan and sedan still in their parking spots. The digital clock on her dashboard showed 10:52 p.m., which meant she'd been dealing with the following truck for over an hour. But that didn't match the mile markers. She should have covered much more distance in that time, or much less, depending on her speed changes. Time and space were becoming unreliable, elastic. At mile marker 127, the spot where the truck had first reappeared after the rest area, Rebecca made another decision. She pulled onto the shoulder and brought her rig to a complete stop, flashers on, parking brake set. If the truck was real, if it was a real driver following her for some reason, they'd have to stop too, or pass her, or do something that proved they existed in the normal physical world. The headlights stopped 3 truck lengths behind her, idling on the shoulder, neither approaching nor leaving, just waiting. Rebecca sat in her cab, watching the lights in her mirror. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing changed. The headlights didn't move. No one exited the truck. The whispers on the CB continued their rhythmic chant. Then the passenger door of her cab rattled as if someone outside were trying the handle. But when Rebecca looked, there was nothing there. The door rattled again, more insistently. The driver's door joined in, both doors shaking as if strong hands were yanking on them from outside. But the parking lot was empty except for her truck and the headlights behind her. The windows began to frost over from the inside, ice crystals forming in elaborate patterns, despite the working climate control showing a cabin temperature of 72 degrees. Through the frosting windows, Rebecca saw movement. Figures surrounding her truck, dark shapes that pressed against the glass, leaving handprints in the frost. The CB voices grew to a crescendo. "Join US, join US, join US." Rebecca screamed and released the parking brake, slamming her truck into gear and flooring the accelerator. Her tires spun on the shoulder before catching, the truck lurching forward and back onto the highway. She pushed the truck to its maximum safe speed, the engine roaring, her rig shaking with the strain. Behind her, the headlights kept pace effortlessly, that same measured distance, unchanging and inevitable. Mile markers flew past. She drove like a woman possessed, but no matter how fast she went, the headlights matched her speed exactly. The frost on her windows wouldn't melt, despite the heater blasting at maximum. Through the clear spot she frantically wiped with her hand, she could see the highway ahead, but it looked wrong now. The lane markings seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the whispered chant from her CB. The darkness on either side of the road seemed deeper than natural, as if the highway had become a bright tunnel cutting through absolute void. And then, ahead in the distance, she saw other trucks. Dozens of them, parked along both shoulders of the highway, their headlights all pointed at the road, creating a gauntlet of light. As Rebecca's truck approached, she could see drivers standing beside their vehicles, all facing the highway, all perfectly still. Some wore modern clothing, others were dressed in styles from decades past. All of them watched as she approached, their faces pale and empty of expression. Rebecca's truck began to slow despite her foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The engine continued to run, but the vehicle was decelerating as if an invisible force was drawing it to a stop. The follower matched her speed, maintaining its distance, herding her toward the gathering of trucks ahead. In absolute panic, Rebecca did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the steering wheel and wrenched it hard to the right, sending her truck off the highway entirely, bouncing across the shoulder and into the open Texas scrubland beyond. Her rig bucked and bounced over the rough terrain, the whole vehicle shuddering with impacts that should have damaged the suspension or punctured her tires. She didn't care. She kept the accelerator down, steering away from the highway, away from the following truck, away from the gathering of drivers that shouldn't exist. Behind her, the headlights stopped at the edge of the highway and didn't pursue further. Rebecca drove across open land for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes until she saw lights ahead. A ranch house, blessedly normal and real. She pulled into their driveway and finally stopped, her whole body shaking, tears streaming down her face. The ranch family who found her there, hysterical and incoherent, called the state police and an ambulance. By the time authorities arrived, Rebecca had calmed down enough to give a statement, though she left out the supernatural elements, claiming only that an aggressive driver had been following her and she'd panicked. The officers helped her get back to the highway, escorting her to a truck stop in Amarillo where she could rest. She quit trucking 2 days later. The company wanted the load delivered, but Rebecca refused to get back in the truck, forfeiting her pay and her deposit on the rig. She never drove commercially again. But sometimes, late at night, her old CB radio, which she'd kept as a bizarre memento, would crackle to life and she'd hear those whispers calling to her, "Join us. We're still waiting. We're always waiting. We'll be here when you're ready to drive again." She never was. Story 4, The Backwards Mile. Thomas Brennan had been running the same route for 6 years. A simple overnight haul from Minneapolis to Chicago, departing at 10 p.m. and arriving by 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. He knew every mile of I-94, every rest stop, every quirk of traffic flow at different times of night. The route had become so familiar it was almost meditative, allowing his mind to wander while his hands and eyes managed the vehicle on autopilot. But on a Wednesday night in October 2017, Thomas discovered that familiarity could become its own kind of trap. The run started normally. Thomas departed the distribution center in Minneapolis at 10:07 p.m., his trailer loaded with automotive parts destined for outside Chicago. The weather was clear and cold, temperature hovering just above freezing, the kind of crisp autumn night that made for good driving. Traffic was light through the metro area, and by 11 p.m. Thomas was well into Wisconsin, making excellent time. At 11:34 p.m., Thomas passed mile marker 267, a spot he'd passed thousands of times before. He noted it unconsciously, the way a commuter might notice a familiar landmark, and continued driving. His satellite radio was playing a podcast about unsolved mysteries, somewhat ironically given what was about to happen. His coffee was still hot in the cup holder. His GPS showed an estimated arrival time of 6:52 a.m. ahead of schedule. 1 minute later, at 11:35 p.m. according to his dashboard clock, Thomas passed mile marker 267 again. At first, he didn't register what had happened. The human brain is remarkably good at dismissing anomalies, at constructing rational explanations for the irrational. He must have misread the first marker, Thomas thought. His mind had been wandering, and he'd probably seen marker 266 or 268 and misremembered. He continued driving, eyes on the road, letting the momentary confusion fade. But at 11:36 p.m., He passed mile marker 267 for a third time. Now Thomas was paying attention. He'd definitely seen 267 three times in 3 minutes, which was impossible. Mile markers don't repeat. He checked his speedometer, 68 miles per hour, steady on cruise control. He looked at his GPS, which showed his position advancing normally along I-94, the blue dot of his truck moving eastward across the display. But the mile markers told a different story. At 11:37 p.m., mile marker 267 appeared in his headlights for a fourth time. Thomas canceled his cruise control and let his truck slow down, moving to the right lane, trying to process what was happening. He passed the marker slowly this time, watching it carefully, confirming the number. 267. Definitely 267. He continued driving, watching for the next marker. After what should have been 1 minute at his reduced speed, he saw the sign appear in his headlights. Mile marker 267, again. His heart began to race. This was impossible. He was driving forward, his speedometer confirmed he was moving, his GPS showed progress, but the mile markers were repeating. He grabbed his phone to call who? The police, his dispatcher. What would he even say? He looked at the phone screen and felt his stomach drop. No signal. His phone showed full battery, but 0 bars of service, no data connection, nothing. The CB radio was silent. Usually there was at least some ambient chatter, trucks communicating about traffic or weather, but now there was only a faint static hiss. Breaker 19, this is Thomas Brennan eastbound on I-94 near mile marker 267, he called into the radio. Anyone reading me? Nothing. Just static. Thomas continued driving, now watching his odometer instead of his speed. The odometer was counting up normally, the 10th digit rolling over with metronomic regularity. He was definitely moving. But every minute, sometimes every 30 seconds, mile marker 267 would appear in his headlights. He passed it slow, he passed it fast, he passed it in the right lane and the left lane, but he couldn't get past it. After the 15th repetition, Thomas noticed something else. The road looked identical every time he passed the marker. There was a slight curve to the left about 200 yards beyond the marker. There was a reflector post on the right shoulder. There was a patch in the road surface shaped vaguely like the state of Texas. These landmarks repeated with every loop, appearing in exactly the same positions, like scenery in a video game level, designed to give the illusion of forward progress while actually going nowhere. Thomas's breathing grew shallow. He was trapped in a loop, repeating the same mile of highway over and over. But how? And more importantly, why? He tried to remember if anything unusual had happened before the looping started. Had he seen anything strange, passed any unusual vehicles, run over something in the road? Nothing came to mind. One moment he'd been driving normally, and the next he'd been caught in this impossible repetition. At 12:03 a.m., 29 minutes after the looping began, Thomas made a decision. He brought his truck to a complete stop right at mile marker 267, pulled on the parking brake, and stepped out of the cab. The cold air hit him immediately, and he was grateful for it. The physical sensation proved he was awake, not dreaming. The asphalt beneath his boots was real. The truck was real. But the situation was impossible. He walked to the mile marker and touched it. Solid metal, cold under his fingers. He looked down the highway in both directions. Behind him, the road stretched into darkness, empty of traffic. Ahead, the same empty highway disappearing in. No lights, no vehicles, nothing but his truck and the dark road and the marker reading 267. Thomas pulled out his flashlight and examined the area around the marker, looking for anything unusual. The shoulder looked normal. The grass beyond looked normal. Everything was mundane and ordinary except for the fact that he was stuck in a temporal or spatial loop that shouldn't exist. He considered walking down the highway, seeing if he could leave the looped area on foot, but something about the darkness ahead discouraged him. It looked too deep, too absolute, as if walking into it might mean never walking back. He returned to his truck and got back in the cab. The clock showed 12:11 a.m. He'd been stopped for 8 minutes and nothing had changed. He put the truck in gear and started driving again, watching the odometer count up, watching for the mile marker he knew would appear. Sure enough, after 0.8 miles on his odometer, mile marker 267 appeared again. He was still trapped. Thomas tried driving backward, putting the truck in reverse and backing down the highway. The mile marker disappeared behind him, and for a moment he felt a surge of hope. But after backing up for what his odometer said was a mile, a different mile marker appeared in his reverse lights. Mile marker 267. He was looping backward now too. Panic was setting in. Thomas had always considered himself level-headed, analytical, good in a crisis. But this situation had no rational explanation, no clear solution. He was stuck in a single mile of highway that repeated endlessly in both directions, like a treadmill made of asphalt and darkness. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, but he was burning diesel with every loop. Eventually, he'd run out of fuel. Then what? At 12:47 a.m., something changed. As Thomas completed another loop and approached mile marker 267 once again, he saw a figure standing beside it. A man in dark clothing, completely still, facing the highway. Thomas's headlights illuminated the figure as he approached, and he could see it was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned uniform, the kind of outfit highway workers might have worn decades ago. The figure didn't move as Thomas passed, didn't turn its head or acknowledge the truck in any way. Thomas checked his mirror and saw the figure still standing there, motionless beside the marker. On the next loop, the figure was in the same position, like a mannequin or a statue. Loop after loop, it remained there, always in exactly the same pose. Thomas tried to get a better look at the figure's face, but every time the angle of his headlights created shadows that obscured the features. More time passed, more loops. Thomas lost count of how many times he'd circled through the same mile of highway. His fuel gauge had dropped to half a tank, then a quarter. His phone's clock became unreliable, sometimes jumping forward several minutes, sometimes ticking backward. The only constant was the mile marker and the figure standing beside it and the unchanging geography of the loop. At some point, Thomas had lost track of what time it should be. A second figure appeared. This one was a woman in modern clothing, standing on the opposite shoulder from the first figure. Like the man, she stood perfectly still, facing the highway. On subsequent loops, more figures appeared, adding one by one until there were a dozen people standing along that repeated mile of highway, all motionless, all facing the road, all watching Thomas pass again and again. Thomas's mental state was deteriorating. The repetition was maddening, each loop identical to the last. The same curve, the same reflector post, the same patch in the road, over and over and over. He tried screaming, thinking maybe the release would help, but the sound just died in the cab, absorbed by the upholstery and the overwhelming weight of the impossible situation. He tried closing his eyes and driving blind, hoping that if he couldn't see the loop, he might somehow escape it, but fear forced his eyes open before he'd gone more than a few seconds. The figures began to move, not walking or gesturing, but their positions changed between loops. One loop they'd be on the shoulders, the next they'd be standing in the traffic lanes, forcing Thomas to swerve around them. Their poses changed too. Some had their arms raised, pointing at his truck. Others stood with heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their faces remained obscured, but Thomas had the overwhelming sensation of being watched, evaluated, judged. His fuel gauge hit empty. The low fuel warning chimed insistently. Thomas knew he had perhaps 30 miles of range left, perhaps less. 30 more loops through this nightmare mile, and then his truck would coast to a stop, and he'd be stranded here with the standing figures and the repeating road and no escape. In desperation, Thomas did something he hadn't tried before. On the next approach to mile marker 267, instead of staying on the highway, he cranked the wheel hard and drove straight toward the mile marker itself, leaving the road entirely, bouncing over the shoulder and into the grass beyond. He aimed directly at the marker, accelerating, planning to knock it down to break the loop by destroying its anchor point. His truck hit the marker with a metal crunch, the post bending and snapping off at its base. The impact jolted Thomas forward against his seatbelt, and then everything went dark. Not the darkness of night, but absolute darkness, complete absence of light. His headlights were gone, his dashboard lights were gone, everything was black. And then light returned, and Thomas found himself driving on I-94 in normal traffic. Cars passed him on the left. A digital billboard advertised a casino. His GPS showed his position near mile marker 305, 38 miles past the cursed marker 267. His dashboard clock showed 2:14 a.m. His fuel gauge read just under a quarter tank, consistent with having driven from Minneapolis to his current position. Thomas pulled into the next rest area and sat in his truck, hands shaking, trying to understand what had happened. Had it been real? He checked his dash cam footage, but the memory card was corrupted, showing only static. His CB radio worked fine now, with normal traffic chatter. His phone had full signal. Everything was normal except for Thomas's memory of spending nearly 3 hours trapped in a repeating mile of highway. He completed his delivery to Chicago, but he filed a report with his dispatcher claiming mechanical issues had delayed him. He never mentioned the loop. Who would believe him? 2 weeks later, Thomas changed routes, requesting daytime runs on different highways. He never drove I-94 through Wisconsin at night again. But sometimes, when he passes a mile marker, any mile marker on any highway, he experiences a moment of vertigo, a fear that this will be the marker that repeats, that he'll be trapped again in that impossible loop, driving forever through a single mile of highway that exists outside of normal space and time. And late at night, when he can't sleep, Thomas researches missing truckers, drivers who vanished from highways without a trace. He wonders if they're still out there, trapped in their own loops, driving the same mile over and over, watched by silent figures, burning through their fuel 1 gallon at a time, waiting for an escape that never comes. Story 5. The cargo THAT screamed. Vincent Park had transported nearly everything imaginable in his 12 years of dedicated refrigerated hauling. Frozen foods, fresh produce, pharmaceutical products, flowers, even human organs for transplant. He'd become accustomed to the responsibility of temperature-sensitive cargo, the constant monitoring of his reefer unit, the precise record-keeping required for such loads. But in March 2016, Vincent accepted a job that would make him question everything he thought he knew about his profession. The pickup was at an unmarked facility outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The dispatch order had been vague: biological specimens, climate-controlled, urgent delivery to research facility in Atlanta. The pay was exceptional, nearly triple his normal rate for a comparable distance, with a significant bonus for on-time delivery. The only unusual requirements were that he maintain a constant temperature of exactly 37 degrees Fahrenheit, and that he was absolutely prohibited from opening the trailer doors during transit. Vincent arrived at the facility at 6:00 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. The building was a low, windowless concrete structure surrounded by high fencing and security cameras. A guard at the gate checked his credentials against a clipboard, made a phone call, then waved him through to the loading dock. The whole process felt more like a military installation than a commercial shipping operation, but Vincent had hauled government contracts before and knew they came with extra security protocols. The loading process was handled by facility personnel who told Vincent to wait in his cab. Through his mirrors, he could see them using a forklift to load what appeared to be 12 identical white crates, each about 4 feet square, into his trailer. The crates had no visible markings except for temperature warning labels and handle with extreme care notices. The loading took 20 minutes, and then a man in a lab coat approached Vincent's window. Temperature must not deviate from 37 degrees by more than 2 degrees in either direction, the man said, his tone serious. If your reefer unit malfunctions, you call this number immediately. He handed Vincent a card with a phone number and nothing else. Do not open the trailer. Do not investigate the cargo. Do not deviate from the prescribed route. Understood, Vincent nodded, though something about the man's intensity made him uneasy. What am I hauling exactly? I need to know for the shipping manifest. Your manifest says biological specimens. That's all you need to know. The man stepped back from the truck. Drive safely, Mr. Park. Time is critical. Vincent secured the load paperwork, set his reefer unit to precisely 37 degrees, and pulled out of the facility. The sun was setting as he merged on eastbound, beginning the 12-hour drive to Atlanta. His reefer unit hummed steadily, the sound a familiar companion. Everything seemed normal for the first hour. At 7:43 p.m., somewhere between Baton Rouge and the Louisiana-Mississippi border, Vincent heard the first noise from his trailer. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the sound of his engine and the reefer unit, but it was definitely there, a soft scratching sound like fingernails on metal. Vincent checked his mirrors, verifying that his trailer doors were still secured. He adjusted his own hearing, wondering if he'd imagined it. But the sound came again, more distinct this time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Vincent told himself it was vibration, the crates shifting slightly despite being properly secured, some corner or edge rubbing against the trailer's interior. He'd heard similar sounds before on other loads. Nothing to worry about. He continued driving, trying to focus on the road, but his attention kept returning to that scratching sound, which seemed to be getting louder. By 8:30 p.m., the scratching had been joined by other sounds, creaking, as if the crates themselves were flexing or expanding. And beneath that, something that sounded disturbingly like breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic exhalations. Vincent's rational mind rejected the idea. The cargo was in a refrigerated trailer at 37 degrees. Nothing living could be breathing in those conditions. The sounds had to be mechanical, perhaps the reefer unit itself creating acoustic artifacts. At 9:15 p.m., Vincent pulled into a truck stop near Hattiesburg, Mississippi for fuel. As he stood beside his truck while the diesel pumped, he found himself staring at his trailer, listening. The reefer unit ran steadily, maintaining temperature, but from inside he could definitely hear sounds, scratching, creaking, and that slow, rhythmic breathing that his mind insisted couldn't be real. He walked to the back of his trailer and placed his hand on the door. The metal was cold from the refrigeration, vibrating slightly with the reefer unit's operation. The scratching sound was louder here, and now Vincent could hear something else, a low moan, barely audible but unmistakably organic. Something alive was in his trailer. Vincent pulled out the card the lab coat man had given him and dialed the number. It rang 6 times before someone answered. Specimen Transport Emergency Line. The voice was flat, professional, devoid of inflection. This is Vincent Park, driver ID 4471. I'm hauling biological specimens from Baton to Atlanta, and I'm hearing sounds from inside the trailer. It sounds like something's alive in there. There was a pause. What is your current location? Truck stop near Hattiesburg. Listen, what am I actually transporting? I have a right to know what's in my trailer. Mr. Park, the specimens are properly contained. The sounds you're hearing are normal. The biological materials sometimes produce acoustic phenomena during transport. This is expected and not cause for concern. It sounds like breathing, like something moaning. Continue to your destination. Maintain the specified temperature. Do not open the trailer. You're being paid well to follow these simple instructions. The line went dead. Vincent stood in the truck stop parking lot, phone in hand, feeling the weight of a decision. He could abandon the load, refuse to haul cargo he didn't understand, but that would mean forfeiting the substantial payment, possibly facing legal consequences for breach of contract. And realistically, what were the actual risks? The cargo was contained, the reefer unit was working perfectly, and he'd be in Atlanta in less than 8 hours. He got back in his truck and returned to the highway. The sounds grew worse after midnight. The scratching became pounding, rhythmic impacts against the trailer's interior walls that Vincent could feel through his seat. The moaning rose in volume and frequency, sometimes sounding like words, though he couldn't make out what they might be saying. The breathing became labored, ragged, as if whatever was in those crates was struggling. At 1:30 a.m., Vincent's reefer unit alarm went off. The temperature was rising, 38 degrees, 39, 40. He pulled onto the shoulder and ran to the reefer unit, checking the controls. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, but the temperature continued to climb. 41 degrees, 42. The pounding from inside the trailer intensified, becoming frantic. Vincent called the emergency number again. The temperature is climbing. My reefer unit shows operational, but the trailer temp is at 43 degrees and rising. You must get the temperature down immediately. Use your backup cooling system. I don't have a backup system. This is a standard reefer unit. Then you need to open the trailer and check for blockages in the cooling vents. You told me not to open the trailer under any circumstances. The specimens will be compromised if the temperature exceeds 45 degrees. Open the trailer, clear any blockages, get the temperature down. The line went dead again. Vincent stood beside his truck on the dark shoulder of I-10, swarming in his headlights, the temperature gauge now reading 44 degrees. The pounding from inside was continuous now, multiple impact points, as if a dozen fists were hammering on the trailer walls. And the moaning had become screaming, high-pitched, agonized screaming that couldn't possibly be acoustic phenomena or mechanical sounds. His hands shaking, Vincent unlocked the trailer doors. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping air that was warmer than it should have been. He pulled the door open a few inches, pointing his flashlight inside. The 12 white crates were arranged in 2 rows of 6. They were moving, not shifting from vibration, but actively moving, rocking back and forth, and the sides of the crates were bulging outward as if tremendous pressure was being applied from inside. The screaming was coming from the crates, multiple voices, overlapping, creating a chorus of agony that made Vincent's blood run cold. One of the crates nearest the door was cracking, the plastic material splitting along stress lines. Through the crack, Vincent could see something inside, something pink and glistening and definitely organic. It looked like flesh, but wrong somehow, the texture irregular, and as he watched in horror, it pressed against the crack, widening it, and an eye appeared in the gap. A human eye, wide and bloodshot, rolling in its socket, fixing on Vincent with an expression of desperate pleading. Vincent stumbled backward, nearly falling off the trailer's loading platform. The eye blinked. A mouth appeared in another crack, lips moving, forming words. "Help us, please help us." The voice was thick, distorted, but unmistakably human. Every instinct screamed at Vincent to run, to get away from the trailer and whatever nightmare it contained. But that eye was looking at him, that mouth was begging him, and despite his terror, he couldn't turn away. "What are you?" he managed to ask. "They changed us," the mouth said, more cracks spreading across the crate's surface. "The testing, we were patients. They said they could cure us, but they changed us, made us into this, trapped us. Help us. Let us out." Other crates were cracking now, other eyes appearing, other mouths forming in the broken surfaces. All of them speaking, all begging for release, all trapped in those white containers that were failing in the rising temperature. Vincent's mind reeled. These weren't specimens. These were people, or what used to be people, transformed into something else, shipped like cargo in his trailer. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. As it rang, the crates burst open. Not all at once, but in sequence like a horrible flowering. What emerged from them defied description. Forms that had once been human but had been reshaped, remade, combined. Multiple faces on single masses of flesh. Arms growing from impossible angles. Bodies that seemed to be turning inside out, organs visible, bones exposed, but still somehow alive, still conscious, still in agony. They spilled out of the crates and onto the trailer floor, moving with disturbing fluidity despite their grotesque forms. And they were reaching toward Vincent, dozens of malformed hands extended, all those eyes looking at him with desperate hope, all those mouths crying out for help, for mercy, for an end to whatever had been done to them. Vincent screamed and slammed the trailer doors shut, throwing the locking bar into place. The 911 call had connected, and a dispatcher was asking about his emergency, but Vincent couldn't form words. He could only make incoherent sounds while the things in his trailer pounded on the doors from inside, their screams muffled but still audible, still pleading. Headlights appeared on the highway, not police responding to his call, but two black SUVs that pulled onto the shoulder ahead of and behind Vincent's truck, boxing him in. Men in dark uniforms emerged, moving with military precision. One of them walked up to Vincent, who was standing frozen beside his trailer, phone still in his hand. "Mr. Park, step away from the vehicle." The man's voice was calm, authoritative. "There are people in there, they're alive, they need help. We're aware, this is now a federal matter, step away from the vehicle." "What did they do to them? What kind of testing?" The man's hand moved to the weapon at his belt. "Mr. Park, step away from the vehicle now, or you will be placed under arrest for interfering with classified government operations." Vincent stepped back, watching as the uniformed men surrounded his trailer. One of them attached a device to the reefer unit, and Vincent heard the compressor kick into overdrive. Another opened a panel and injected something into the trailer's atmosphere system. Within seconds, the screaming from inside began to fade, the pounding becoming weaker, then stopping entirely. The man who'd spoken to Vincent handed him an envelope. Inside is a check for the agreed-upon amount plus a substantial bonus. Also inside is a non-disclosure agreement. You will sign it, you will forget everything you saw tonight, and you will never speak of this to anyone. If you violate this agreement, you will spend the rest of your life in a federal prison on national security charges. Do you understand? Vincent took the envelope with numb fingers. They were people. They were volunteers for experimental treatment who knew the risks. The treatment had unfortunate side effects. They're being transported to a facility where they can receive appropriate care. That's all you need to know. The man gestured to one of the SUVs. "We'll take over transport from here. You're free to go. My truck will be returned to you within 72 hours, thoroughly cleaned and inspected. The rental vehicle over there is for your use in the interim." The man pointed to a sedan parked at the edge of the scene. Vincent wanted to argue, to refuse, to call the real police, to do something. But the uniformed men, the weapons, the bureaucratic efficiency of it all, and the things he'd seen in his trailer, his mind couldn't process it all. He took the envelope, got into the rental car, and drove away, leaving his truck and its screaming cargo behind. He never drove commercially again. The check in the envelope was enough to pay off his mortgage and put money aside, the bonus apparently calculated to buy his silence. He signed the non-disclosure agreement in a lawyer's office 2 days later, his hand shaking as he wrote his name. His truck was returned exactly 72 hours later, immaculately clean, the trailer interior looking factory new, as if nothing had ever been transported inside. But Vincent knows what he saw. He knows what he heard. And sometimes, late at night, he still hears that screaming, still sees those desperate eyes, still remembers those pleading voices begging for help that he couldn't give. He wonders if they're still alive, those transformed people, suffering in some government facility. He wonders how many other drivers have transported similar cargo, following instructions, maintaining temperatures, never asking questions, never looking inside. And he wonders if someday someone will come for him too to make sure his silence remains permanent. Story 6. The rest stop that wasn't there. Gerald Hutchison maintained meticulous logs of every route he drove, every rest stop he used, every fuel station where he filled his tanks. In 17 years of professional driving, he developed systems and routines that kept him safe, efficient, and on schedule. His logbook was a masterpiece of organization, with notes about traffic patterns, construction zones, and which rest areas had the cleanest facilities or the best vending machines. But in September 2019, Gerald stopped at a rest area that appeared in none of his logs, on none of his maps, and according to everyone he later asked, didn't exist at all. He was running eastbound through Kansas, hauling agricultural equipment from Denver to Indianapolis. It was a route he'd driven at least 40 times before, straight and monotonous, cutting through endless plains. The sky that afternoon was vast and empty, with clouds piled on the horizon like distant mountains. Gerald had been driving for 6 hours and was due for a break. According to his GPS and his mental map of the route, the next rest area was about 40 miles ahead near Salina. But at 4:17 p.m., he saw a rest area sign he didn't recognize. The blue sign with its white symbols indicated facilities ahead, restrooms, parking, picnic areas. The sign looked official, identical to every other interstate rest area sign, but Gerald frowned as he approached. There shouldn't be a rest area here. He'd driven this stretch of I-70 dozens of times, and there was nothing between his current position and the Salina facility. Curiosity overrode his confusion. Gerald activated his turn signal and took the exit, ascending a gentle rise to a rest area that looked completely normal. There was a parking lot with designated spaces for trucks and cars, a modern brick building housing facilities, a few picnic tables under a shelter, and a well-maintained lawn with a flagpole. 2 other vehicles occupied the lot, a sedan and a minivan. Everything appeared ordinary, freshly maintained, exactly what you'd expect from a Kansas Department of Transportation rest facility. Gerald parked his truck and sat for a moment, looking around. The facility was nice, maybe nicer than most Kansas rest areas. The grass was very green, almost artificial in its perfection. The building looked new, with no weathering or aging visible on the brickwork. Even the parking lot's surface was pristine, without the cracks and patches common to most rest areas subjected to heavy truck traffic and harsh winter weather. He stepped out of his truck, and immediately something felt off. The air was too still. Kansas was a windy state, and in all his years driving through it, Gerald had never experienced truly calm air. But here, there was no wind at all. The flag hung limp on its pole. The trees bordering the rest area stood motionless. Even the grass didn't stir. Gerald walked toward the building, passing the sedan and minivan. Both vehicles were empty, their occupants presumably inside the facility or using the picnic area. But something about the vehicles bothered him, and it took a moment to identify what. They were clean. Not deliberately clean, but showroom clean, without the dust and grime that accumulates on cars driving through Kansas. And they were generic, a white sedan and a blue minivan, both without license plates, both without any identifying features or personal items visible through the windows. The building's entrance was a set of glass doors leading into a lobby area with hallways branching to men's and women's restrooms. Everything was spotlessly clean, lit by fluorescent fixtures that hummed softly. The tile floor reflected the lights with a wet shine. Gerald's footsteps echoed as he walked, sounding too loud in the silence. He entered the men's room and stopped just inside the doorway. The facility was immaculate, almost obsessively so. The tile gleamed. The stainless steel fixtures shone like mirrors. The air smelled strongly of industrial cleaner, but beneath that was something else. a faint sweetness that reminded Gerald of funeral flowers. There were 5 stalls and 3 urinals, all pristine, but there was no one else in the restroom, which seemed odd given the 2 vehicles outside. Gerald used the facilities and washed his hands, watching himself in the mirror above the sinks. His reflection looked normal: tired eyes, graying beard, the worn baseball cap he always wore while driving. But the longer he looked, the more his reflection seemed wrong in subtle ways. The movements didn't quite sync. When he turned his head, the reflection lagged by a fraction of a second. When he blinked, the reflection blinked at a slightly different rhythm. He left the restroom quickly, emerging back into the lobby. A water fountain stood against one wall, and Gerald realized he was thirsty. He approached it and pressed the button, but instead of the expected arc of water, the fountain produced a thick, syrupy liquid that was faintly brown in color. Gerald jerked his hand away from the button, and the liquid stopped flowing immediately, leaving no trace on the fountain's surface. Fear was beginning to override curiosity. This place was wrong. Gerald turned to leave, heading for the glass doors and his truck beyond, but a sound stopped him. Music was playing, very faint, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It sounded like music from the 1950s, a big band or orchestra playing a pleasant, forgettable melody. But the music had a warped quality, as if the recording was degraded or playing at the wrong speed. Against his better judgment, Gerald followed the sound. A hallway extended past the restrooms, leading to what the signs indicated were vending machines and a visitor information area. Gerald walked down the hall, the music growing slightly louder, and emerged into a room lined with vending machines and informational displays about Kansas tourism. The vending machines were full of products, but nothing Gerald recognized. The sodas had labels with familiar color schemes: red and white, blue and red. But the brand names were wrong, strings of letters that didn't form any words he knew. The snacks were similarly off, with packaging that looked almost right but with details that were incorrect in ways he couldn't quite identify. The music was coming from a speaker in the ceiling, and Gerald could now hear that beneath the melody were voices, hundreds of them, whispering in unison. He couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm matched the music, as if the whispers were singing along. The sound made his skin crawl. He turned to leave and found he wasn't alone. A man stood in the hallway behind him, blocking the path back to the lobby. The man wore a uniform that looked like a rest area maintenance worker's outfit, with a name tag that read attendant rather than an actual name. His face was neutral, expressionless, his eyes looking at Gerald without blinking. "Can I help you find something?" the attendant asked, his voice perfectly pleasant and completely devoid of emotion. "No, I'm just leaving," Gerald said, trying to step around the man. The attendant moved to block him, not aggressively but definitively. "But you just arrived. Wouldn't you like to rest? That's what this place is for, rest, staying a while, becoming comfortable." "I need to get back to my truck." "Your truck is perfectly safe. Everything here is safe. This is a rest area, a place between places, a stop along the way. You can rest here as long as you need." The attendant's face didn't change expression as he spoke, his eyes still unblinking, fixed on Gerald with unnerving intensity. Gerald's heart was racing now. He was a large man, 6'2" and 200 pounds, and he'd handled difficult situations before, but something about the attendant terrified him on a primal level. "I'm leaving now," Gerald said, his voice firm despite his fear. "Step aside." "Others have stayed," the attendant said. "They found peace here, rest from their journeys." They became part of the facility, helping other travelers, making sure everyone is comfortable. The attendant gestured to the vending machines, the informational displays. "Don't you want to be helpful? Don't you want to rest?" Gerald didn't answer. He charged forward, using his size and weight to bowl past the attendant, who offered no physical resistance but whose voice followed Gerald down the hallway. "You can't leave. No one leaves once they understand. You'll come back. They always..." Gerald burst through the glass doors and into the parking lot, running for his truck. The sedan and minivan were gone. In their place were two older vehicles, a car from the 1960s and a van from the 1970s, both in perfect condition, both without license plates. More vehicles had appeared throughout the lot, all from different decades, all pristine, all empty. The parking lot that had held 3 vehicles when Gerald arrived now held dozens. He reached his truck and yanked open the door, pulling himself into the cab. His hands shook as he started the engine, and he'd never been so grateful to hear the diesel motor rumble to life. He put the truck in gear and accelerated toward the exit, not bothering with a slow, careful departure. He just needed to get away from this place. The exit ramp curved down to rejoin I-70, and Gerald took it too fast, his trailer swaying as he merged onto the eastbound lanes. He didn't care. He pushed his truck up to speed, watching in his mirrors as the rest area receded into the distance. The building, the parking lot full of vehicles from different eras, the two green grass, all of it disappearing behind him. Gerald drove for an hour before he felt calm enough to think clearly. He pulled into the actual rest area near Selena, a facility he'd used many times before, with familiar features and normal imperfections and blessed ordinary activity. He parked and pulled out his phone, intending to report what he'd experienced. But report it to whom? The Kansas Department of Transportation, the police. What would he even say? He opened his GPS and scrolled back along his route, looking for the rest area he'd stopped at. There was nothing there. The GPS showed I-70 as an unbroken line through that section, with no exits, no facilities, nothing. He checked online maps, looked at interstate rest area directories, even called the Kansas DOT information line. No rest area existed where he'd stopped. Over the following weeks, Gerald became somewhat obsessed with finding evidence of the facility. He drove I-70 through Kansas twice more, watching carefully for the exit or any sign of the rest area. He found nothing. The section of highway where he'd stopped showed no exit, no ramp, no indication anything had ever been there. The landscape was open plains with no buildings visible from the interstate. He joined online forums for truckers, posting about his experience, asking if anyone else had encountered a rest area that shouldn't exist. Most responses were jokes or suggestions that he'd been overtired and hallucinating. 3 drivers sent him private messages. One had stopped at a rest area in Nebraska that didn't appear on maps. Another had found a facility in Montana that seemed frozen in time. The third had entered a rest area in Arizona and claimed the attendant had tried to convince him to stay forever. All 3 described similar details: the too perfect maintenance, the wrong vending machines, the feeling that the place existed slightly outside normal reality. And all 3 had fled when they realized something was fundamentally wrong. None of them had been able to find the facilities again or locate them on maps. They were places between places, temporary intrusions of something else into the normal world. Gerald never stopped at an unfamiliar rest area again. If his GPS didn't show it, if it wasn't in his logs from previous trips, he drove past no matter how badly he needed a break. He told himself he'd been lucky, that he'd recognized the wrongness quickly enough to escape, that others might not have been so fortunate. But sometimes, late at night, when he's driving through empty stretches of interstate, Gerald sees rest area signs that don't match his maps. The blue signs appear in his headlights, indicating facilities ahead, promising rest and comfort and relief from the endless road. And he wonders how many of them are real and how many are traps, places designed to catch tired travelers, to convince them to rest forever, to become part of the facility like the attendant had suggested. He wonders about those vehicles he'd seen filling the parking lot, cars and vans from different decades, all perfectly maintained, all empty of their drivers. He wonders where those drivers are now, if they're still in that facility somewhere, having accepted the attendant's offer, having found peace in that place between places. And most of all, Gerald wonders if the attendant was right, if some part of him wants to go back, to stop fighting the road and the miles and the endless driving, to finally rest in a place where time works differently and the world's demands can't reach him. The thought terrifies him because sometimes when he's most exhausted, it almost sounds appealing. Almost. Story 7. The Impossible Fog. Raj Patel had driven through every type of weather condition imaginable in his 14 years of commercial trucking. Blizzards in Montana, hurricanes in Florida, ice storms in Pennsylvania, dust storms in New Mexico. He'd learned to respect weather, to adjust his driving for conditions, to know when to push and when to pull over and wait. But on a May evening in 2020, Raj encountered weather that didn't follow any natural rules, fog that behaved in ways fog shouldn't behave. And by the time he escaped it, his understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered. He was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to Ohio, running I-77 northbound through the mountains of Virginia and West Virginia. The weather forecast had been clear, mild temperatures, no precipitation, excellent visibility. The sunset that evening had been spectacular, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Raj had been in good spirits, making excellent time, expecting to reach his delivery point early the next morning. At 9:34 p.m., according to his dashboard clock, Raj entered a bank of fog. This wasn't unusual. Mountain fog was common, especially in the evening when temperatures dropped and moisture condensed in the valleys. What was unusual was how suddenly the fog appeared. One moment, Raj was driving in clear air with unlimited visibility, and the next he was enveloped in fog so thick he could barely see the hood of his truck. There was no transition, no gradual reduction in visibility, just an instant shift from clear to opaque. Raj immediately reduced his speed, activating his hazard lights and fog lights. The lights barely penetrated the gray wall surrounding his truck, creating a small bubble of illumination that extended perhaps 10 feet in any direction. The fog was dense and uniform, without the swirls and eddies normally created by wind and vehicle passage. It looked almost solid, like driving through gray cotton. His GPS showed his position on I-77, but the display looked strange. The map details were blurred, the road appearing as a vague line rather than its usual crisp rendering. His speed showed as 25 miles per hour, appropriate for the limited visibility. But something felt wrong. The GPS showed he was moving, but Raj couldn't shake the feeling that he was stationary, that the truck was running in place while the fog remained unchanged around him. The radio, both AM, FM, and CB, produced only static. His phone showed no signal. These weren't particularly alarming in mountainous areas, but combined with the impossible fog, they added to Raj's growing unease. He considered pulling over, waiting for the fog to lift, but the shoulder of a mountain interstate was dangerous even with hazard lights. Better to keep moving at reduced speed until he emerged from the fog and found a safe place to stop. Minutes passed. The fog remained exactly the same density, same uniform gray color, same absolute stillness. Raj checked his odometer and realized he'd driven 3 miles since entering the fog, but his visibility hadn't improved at all. Fog banks weren't usually this extensive, especially not with such uniform density. There should have been variations, thinner patches, some hint of what lay beyond. At 9:47 p.m., Raj saw movement in the fog ahead. His headlights caught a shape, something large moving across the highway. He slowed further, his hand moving to the horn, expecting an animal to cross in front of him. But the shape didn't cross. It walked parallel to his truck, keeping pace with his reduced speed, staying just at the edge of his visibility. The shape was roughly man-sized but wrong in its proportions. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that were too long and moved with a loose, boneless quality. Raj couldn't make out details through the fog, just that dark silhouette moving alongside his truck, matching his speed exactly. "Hello," Raj called out, immediately feeling foolish. His voice seemed to be absorbed by the fog, dying immediately without even an echo. The shape continued walking, neither approaching nor retreating, just maintaining that constant distance. Raj accelerated slightly and the shape accelerated to match. He slowed and it slowed. It was pacing him deliberately. Raj's breath came faster. He considered stopping entirely, but the presence of the walking figure discouraged that idea. Better to keep moving, to try to outrun it or reach the end of the fog bank. He pressed the accelerator, bringing his speed up to 40 miles per hour, faster than was safe in these conditions, but he needed to break free of whatever was happening. The figure matched his speed, its two long legs moving in a fluid lope that should have been impossible for a human gait. And now there was another figure on the passenger side, the same elongated proportions, the same impossible movement. They were flanking his truck, running alongside him through fog that shouldn't exist, figures that shouldn't be able to keep pace with a vehicle traveling 40 miles per hour. Raj's headlights caught something ahead in the fog, another truck, stationary, parked in the right lane. Raj swerved into the left lane to avoid it, his trailer swaying with the sudden maneuver. As he passed the stationary truck, his lights briefly illuminated it, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The truck was old, decades old, an model from the 50s or 60s. But it looked brand new, no rust, no wear, as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. And standing beside the driver's door was another of those elongated figures, perfectly still, its two long arms hanging to its knees, its face, if it had a face, turned toward Raj as he passed. More trucks appeared, all parked in the right lane, all from different eras, all looking pristine despite their age. And beside each truck stood one of the figures, motionless, watching. The figures flanking Raj's truck peeled away, joining their companions beside the parked vehicles, and for a moment Raj felt relief. But then he saw what was ahead. The fog was changing. It was taking on structure, forming shapes, buildings, trees, streetlights, a whole landscape that flickered in and out of existence like a badly tuned television signal. Raj saw houses from different architectural periods appearing and disappearing in the fog. He saw a gas station that looked like something from the 1930s, its pumps visible for just a moment before the fog swallowed it again. He saw a diner, a motel, a whole town that didn't exist, that couldn't exist, all flickering in the fog like ghostly projections. And there were people. Dozens of them standing along the roadside, all with normal human proportions unlike the elongated figures, but all perfectly motionless, all dressed in clothing from different time periods, all watching as Raj's truck passed. Their faces were visible in his lights for brief moments, and they all wore the same expression, a blank, empty stare that suggested awareness without understanding, life without consciousness. Raj's speedometer showed 50 miles per hour now, faster than he should be going, but terror had overridden caution. He needed to escape this fog, this impossible landscape of flickering buildings and watching figures. His GPS was useless, showing only static patterns. His clock had stopped at 9:47 p.m., frozen at the moment he'd first seen the walking figure. The road beneath his tires felt wrong. Sometimes it seemed smooth, sometimes rough with potholes. Sometimes it felt like he was driving on dirt rather than pavement, all while his eyes told him he was seeing interstate asphalt. His truck's suspension bounced and swayed with impacts from irregularities he couldn't see, as if the road surface and the visual road were completely different things. A structure emerged from the fog ahead, a bridge, or what looked like a bridge, but its architecture was impossible. Port beams curved in directions that defied geometry, intersecting in ways that shouldn't work, creating a structure that couldn't bear its own weight according to any physics Raj understood. But it stood there in the fog, solid and undeniable, and the road ran directly through it. Raj had no choice. He couldn't stop, couldn't turn around on the interstate, could only drive forward through the impossible bridge. As his truck entered the structure, the fog changed color, taking on a reddish tint that reminded Raj of old photographs, sepia-toned images of a world that no longer existed. The sound of his engine became muffled, distant, as if he were hearing it through water or from far away. Inside the bridge, Raj saw more figures, but these were human, or had been human. They stood in alcoves along the bridge's interior, dozens of them, all in various states of decay that ranged from recently dead to skeletal. They were all dressed in trucking clothes from different eras, overalls and caps from the 30s, leather jackets from the 50s, polyester shirts from the 70s, modern high-visibility vests, and they were all watching him pass, their dead eyes following his truck. Raj screamed, a sound that died instantly in the muffled atmosphere. He floored the accelerator, his truck roaring through the impossible bridge at speeds he'd never attempted before. The dead truckers reached out as he passed, their hands grasping at empty air, their mouths moving in silent words. And on every face was the same expression of warning, of desperate communication, as if they were trying to tell him something crucial that he couldn't hear. The bridge ended. Raj's truck burst out of the structure and back into fog, but the fog was different now. It was thinning, becoming wispy, allowing glimpses of normal reality beyond. Stars were visible through gaps in the fog. The road felt solid and consistent again. His speedometer showed 75 miles per hour, and he was shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. Within seconds, he emerged completely from the fog into a clear night. His headlights illuminated normal highway, normal scenery, a normal world that followed normal rules. Raj immediately pulled onto the shoulder, activated his hazards, and sat in his cab with the engine idling, his whole body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his dashboard clock. It showed 9:48 p.m. 1 minute. He'd been in the fog for what felt like at least 20 minutes, had driven for miles through that nightmare land, but only 1 minute had passed. His GPS showed his position on I-77, exactly where it should be based on 1 minute of driving time. His odometer had advanced by less than a mile, but Raj knew what he'd experienced had been real. His hands were white-knuckled from gripping the wheel. His heart was racing. His shirt was soaked with sweat. He hadn't imagined the elongated figures, the flickering town, the impossible bridge, the dead truckers reaching out to him. It had all been real, or as real as anything can be when the normal rules of reality stop applying. He sat on the shoulder for an hour, watching the highway in his mirrors, terrified that the fog would return, that he'd be pulled back into that place between places. But the night remained clear, stars bright overhead, occasional vehicles passing on the interstate, everything blessedly normal and mundane. When he finally pulled back onto the highway and continued his drive, Raj couldn't shake the memory of those dead truckers in the bridge, couldn't stop thinking about their clothing from different eras, their expressions of warning. They'd been trying to tell him something, and he thought he understood what it was, that the fog was a trap, that it caught drivers and pulled them into some liminal space outside normal time, and that those who didn't escape quickly enough became permanent residents, standing in that impossible bridge, watching other drivers pass, trying to warn them. Raj completed his delivery to Ohio the next morning, then drove straight home to North Carolina and quit trucking. He'd saved enough money over the years, and his wife had been asking him to find work closer to home. He took a job at a local warehouse, working day shift, sleeping in his own bed every night, never again spending nights on the highway where fog could appear without warning and pull travelers into places that shouldn't exist. But he never forgot those dead truckers, and he couldn't escape the knowledge that if he'd stayed in the fog just a little longer, if he'd driven just a few more miles through that impossible landscape, he would have joined them, standing in that bridge forever, watching other drivers pass, trying and failing to warn them about the fog that catches travelers and never lets them leave.